Hello. So my name is Connor O'Brien,
I'm Delaney Cotton.
and today we're going to be presenting to you our presentation on Japanese American military service in World War II. So first, we are going to start with this overview. We're going to be talking about a bunch of different things. We're going to be talking about the pre-war a little bit. We're going to be talking about Pearl Harbor. We're going to be talking about the actual military service. We're going to be talking about women's military service. And we're also going to be talking about resistance to that service. So let's get started. So I wanted to start off with this quote because I think it's really prophetic, and I think it kind of sets the stage for what comes next. So I do want to read the quote in full because I think it's important. And for context, this is President Roosevelt to Admiral W.H. Stanley, who is the Admiral of the Pacific Fleet. Quote, "One obvious thought occurs to me. That every Japanese citizen or non-citizen on the island of Oahu who meets these Japanese ships or has any connection with their officers or men should be secretly but definitely identified and his or her name placed on a special list of those who would need to be the first to be placed in a concentration camp in the event of trouble." End quote. So if we look at when this quote, I think it was a letter, I believe, a letter sent to Admiral Stanley. It was sent to him in August of 1936. And just 5 years later, so now the war is in full swing, um, we have Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor was kind of the turning point for America. It's what got America firmly into the war. Before this, they were very much not in favor of the war. The American public did not want to go to war. But after this, it kind of changed. It kind of flipped overnight. Um, so as far as the prejudice towards Japanese Americans, it was already present long before Pearl Harbor. There's kind of this misidentification or this myth that Pearl Harbor was like the start of Japanese American prejudice, when in reality, Japanese Americans did not have land ownership rights or voting rights. That was reserved for white people, specifically white men. So this was long in the making. There was a report in November of 1941, so this is a month before Pearl Harbor. Sorry, and it concluded that Japanese Americans were largely loyal to America. So the fact that they surveyed the Japanese American people right before Pearl Harbor and identified them as loyal, and then a month later Pearl Harbor occurs. It's bound to cause some confusion and strife and some ill will in the government towards Japanese Americans. So in Pearl Harbor itself, which was December 7th, 1941, 2,403 were killed. I believe 16, maybe 19 were civilians. And 19 U.S. Navy ships were sank or damaged. I believe 8 battleships were sank. So it was a really heavy blow to the Pacific Fleet, and many, many lives were lost. So after Pearl Harbor, February, so 2 months, maybe a little more, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066. And this in turn, over 100,000, estimates range from 110 to 120,000 Japanese Americans. They were forced into what some politely call internment camps. They were concentration camps. These were camps in the middle of the desert or in less developed areas that were they were like shanty towns that were set up, and Japanese people were forced to live here. They did not have a choice. The Nisei were the children of these Japanese immigrants, and they were born with American citizenship, but they were still interned. So, regardless of being born on American soil or being an American citizen, these people were still seen as Japanese. So, the choice boiled down to war or jail. The U.S. War Department announced a draft for interned Nisei. On January 20th of 1944, so well into the Pacific War, Japanese Americans were reclassified on the same basis as other citizens. So they were now being seen as the government or they were being seen by the government as regular citizens eligible for the draft. And part of this was because America needed men. They needed, and 100,000, 120,000 men was nothing to sneeze at. So basically, the government said, okay, you're either going to be drafted or you're going to go to jail. And there were a lot of reactions to this across a wide spectrum of concentration camps. Every camp reacted differently, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So I think it's important to kind of think about the choice that these people were confronted with. So I want to read this quote because I think it kind of summarizes how these people felt. Quote, "To comply with the registration was to go on record about one's loyalties and risk sanction for answers the government might deem dangerous. To comply with the draft was to risk one's life." So before the draft, before this whole idea that Japanese Americans were going to go to war, they were required to um, fill out a survey that basically asked, okay, are you loyal to America and do you renounce your Japanese ties to Japan? And you were required to answer that. If the government did not like your answers, they might sanction you, they might punish you, it could be bad for your family. But this draft was kind of a step up from that. So let's go on to service. So there were a lot of Japanese Americans who ended up going into service because either they didn't want to go to jail or they didn't want their families to be punished or interned. And these Japanese Americans sort of coalesced to form the 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Team, or RCT. So there are two sort of chunks of Japanese Americans fighting in World War II. So you have the 100th Battalion, which was actually fighting in Italy before the 442nd RCT was formed. And then when the 442nd was sort of created to for all of these Japanese Americans to fight in, which I do want to mention, this was a segregated unit. So they were not there were it was all Japanese Americans. This was very strictly separated by race, either through because America mistrusted these Japanese Americans or just didn't want to mix um, loyalties in quotes. Um, and the 442nd was formed in 1943, and both combat teams were sort of very widely regarded and highly decorated. They were sort of seen as having a chip on their shoulder, wanting to prove that they were Americans first, and wanting to sort of um, prove their worth to America. And they went on a lot of really interesting missions. There was like basically a real life Saving Private Ryan mission that the 100th Battalion went on, and it was there were a lot of deaths. They had a high turnover in the 100th and 442nd. So very important to note.
Of course, not all of the Japanese Americans that served were on the ground fighting. An important group was known as the Yankee Samurai, and these were Japanese Americans recruited by Army intelligence officers even before Pearl Harbor, as they sensed it would probably be important to have people that knew Japanese and could then interpret and translate messages and other important documents going on during the war. And so these Nisei studied language and linguistics in order to help the war effort, and many of them stayed in Japan and continued to serve even after the war, interpreting, translating, so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about how women were able to serve. So the Women's Auxiliary Corps, or the WAC, began taking on Nisei in November of 1943. These women, of course, had to pass loyalty tests, which was different than the case for German or Italian American women who could just join with no other prerequisites. These women often served as secretaries, linguists, and nurses, many of the traditionally female jobs you might think of from this time period. And many women were reluctant to join, mainly because if sons were being drafted, if daughters left, then their parents might be stuck alone in the internment camps. However, a good amount of women did join. And this quote we have here is from Ruth Fuji, who served in the WAC and kind of describes her experience of packing without knowing where she was going and just being sent to the Philippines with no idea of what she had really signed up for, but just going along with it.
As far as resistance, there was quite a lot. There was refusal, downright refusal to fill out the draft papers. At least 63 in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. There were many arrests. There were many people who just ignored it. There were many people who got violent and protested. And I mean, I read pretty much every camp. There was some kind of reaction. Um, to the draft, and it resulted in many arrests. Arrests, I would like to note that went forward without trial. Many of these people were just arrested and placed in jail for a felony. This was considered a felony, resisting this draft, and it all kind of ties back to the sort of disregarding of civil liberties in the time of war, which while common for every country in America, a country which claims to put these civil liberties above all else, this is particularly egregious. Um, and it was widespread. I'm telling every camp I read, there was some kind of reaction. I think the most common was just a ratcheting up of tensions. Things got very tense, and even in camps where there was no sort of tension or anger, nobody was happy with this.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about what happened after the war was over. And I want to first start with this quote from President Harry S. Truman speaking to the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He said that you fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won. It's a great sentiment, but it wasn't exactly true when these veterans got home and what they experienced. So, after the war, many Japanese Americans really struggled to rebuild. They faced a lot of anti Japanese prejudice from white Americans and Americans of all other races as well. Many of them had been forced to sell their homes for really cheap. During the internment period, and then faced homelessness as a result of that. And many women kind of struggled because they were forced to give up their jobs and the independence they had gained while their husbands were away in war, and now they had to kind of renegotiate what it was like to be back in the household. So it was a difficult time for many, and we see a lot of that in Okada's No No Boy as well.
Okay, so to conclude, the Japanese American community was uh, kind of destroyed by this war in many ways. It was torn apart, it was interned, it was forced to go to war or go to jail. And this was all premeditated. This didn't just happen out of nowhere. And it's important to remember this event so that in the future it is not repeated. And I think that wraps up the presentation. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Um, yeah.